Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to my presentation titled Using Brief Experimental Analysis to Identify the Right Intervention at the Right Time. So starting off with some statistics, the National Assessment of Educational Progress every few years reports the percentage of students who are at or above proficient in math. So back in 2015, they rated these or found these percentages for these different grade levels. So in fourth grade, only 40% of students were at or above proficient in math. That decreased to 33% in eighth grade, and even further to 26% in 12th grade. And so we really want to focus on these things and remediate these areas because the National Mathematics Advisory Council in 2008 noted that math competence accounts for variance in areas such as employment, income, and work productivity. And so when we're looking to remediate academic skills, low academic performance is typically the result of either skill or performance-based deficits. And so skill-based deficits are when students lack development and knowledge of the first two tiers of the instructional hierarchy. So they lack the knowledge to perform a skill with accuracy or fluency. Whereas performance-based deficits, students have these skills, but they choose and lack the motivation to do so. So when we're looking to remediate these skill and performance-based deficits, we want to turn to a few different areas to work on those. So skill-based deficits, so for accuracy, we really want to focus on modeling tasks for students, providing them opportunities to respond and give immediate feedback on those, and then provide reinforcement for accurate responding. For fluency, that opportunities to respond is really what we're going to harp on, and we want to give repeated opportunities to do that, and then providing reinforcement for both accurate and fluent responding. For performance-based deficits, and so students have accuracy and or fluency in a skill, we just want to reinforce the desired responding. So whether they're demonstrating accuracy, but they're not showing us how fluent they are, we want to provide reinforcement for responding fluently, for example. However, it is also possible for students to demonstrate both of these. And so again, in that same example, they may have accuracy in this skill and fluency, but they're not demonstrating the fluency. So we may need to, and they may lack fluency even. So it may require multiple components in this type of scenario where they're unmotivated and lacking fluency as a skill in general. So brief experimental analysis is a methodology for identifying an intervention that is functionally relevant to a student's deficit. And this generally involves rapidly implementing interventions and observing the effects of each intervention on student performance. That way we can identify which intervention is most effective for a student. And so most of brief experimental analysis research has been conducted in the area of reading. And so studies often target oral reading fluency and utilize interventions such as repeated readings. And so with oral reading fluency, we'll be looking at things such as words read correctly per minute for students. And so several interventions will be rapidly alternated, and we'll see which ones have the biggest impact on their words read correctly per minute. And so some of these intervention packages that may be utilized for this are listening passage preview with repeated readings, which targets accuracy and fluency. And so listening passage preview, the reading of the passage is modeled to students, and then they read that same passage over and over again. If they don't require that modeling component, so they have accuracy, we can just use repeated readings to target fluency. And so they just read the same passage over and over again with feedback provided. And then if they are accurate and fluent, but lack the motivation to show this for us, we can use contingent reward. And so if they reach a certain level of words read correctly per minute, they can get a reward for their performance. However, relatively few studies with brief experimental analysis have been conducted in the area of math. So initial studies implemented interventions which all targeted the same intervention. So for example, studies used math interventions that all targeted accuracy. And so it's only been recently that studies have included interventions that target different deficits. So there may be an intervention for targeting accuracy, there may be one for fluency, and there may also be a contingent reward type intervention to address performance-based deficits. And so even though some studies recently have targeted different areas, no research had targeted all three yet, such as the intervention packages that we had seen with oral reading fluency in the reading literature. There's also been an issue with a misuse of accuracy and fluency interventions. And so some of these problems being that the effect of accuracy interventions has almost exclusively been measured with fluency dependent variables, such as anything per minute, so digits correct per minute, words read correctly per minute. And so when you're adding that time-based component in there, you're really looking at fluency instead of the percentage of digits they're getting correct or words that they're reading correct. And in addition, one of the most frequently used interventions to target fluency in the literature has been constant time delay. However, constant time delay should be considered as an accuracy intervention because it has a modeling component to it. And so no brief experimental analyses studies with math have included an intervention that specifically targets fluency. And so the purpose of the study was fourfold. And so just to generally extend the brief experimental analysis mathematics literature by adapting oral reading fluency intervention packages to math, and meaning to have an intervention that targets accuracy, that targets fluency, and targets those performance-based deficits. Also to examine the utility of brief experimental analysis with more advanced mathematics calculations. Every study up until this point had used simple and basic math facts, so single-digit addition, subtraction, and multiplication facts. And then to also utilize dependent variables for both accuracy and fluency, which I'll get into momentarily. And then finally, to determine the utility of a follow-up brief experimental analysis to adjust to skill acquisition. So if a brief experimental analysis identifies one intervention that improves their performance, do they reach a point where now one of the other interventions would be more effective for them? And so in adapting that kind of oral reading literature intervention packages over to math, contingent reward remained the same. So for students with performance-based deficits, if they're going to kind of beat their previous scores or reach a set criteria, then they can get access to reinforcers and rewards of their choosing. And so repeated readings is then transposed over to repeated practice. And so this just provided students with multiple opportunities to solve the same math problems over and over. And then finally, listening passage preview with repeated readings was turned into cover copy compare with repeated practice. And so, as I mentioned previously, that listening passage preview provides that modeling where you as the interventionist are going to read a story to a student before they read it themselves. Cover copy compare is one of the most extensively researched interventions, particularly in math, and it's been suggested to be most effective with students who lack accuracy, and it provides modeling for students because they get to look at a problem and they see it modeled out, completely solved with all the components. They cover the model up, they solve it themselves, and then they uncover the model and compare their answer, and so they get that immediate feedback as well if they solved it correctly as demonstrated by the model. And so, as I mentioned, with more advanced mathematics, so instead of simple and basic math facts, students were doing 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. And so, in keeping with the current climate of education and some of the methods that are being taught to students currently, the area model for 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication has become fairly popular in schools due to its effectiveness in assisting students with developing their math reasoning. And so schools and curriculum will teach students this area model so that they can kind of develop an understanding of 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication, and then they will transition students, once they are able to develop that math reasoning, into what's referred to as the standard algorithm, which is what I'm sure most of you would relate to having been taught when you were in school. And so this just consists of, in this example problem, of 12 times 24, breaking the 12 into 10 and 2, the 24 into 20 and 4, and then multiplying across the boxes and adding all of those together to get to our answer. So the methods for this study were teachers were asked to identify students who were inaccurate responders with 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. And so participants ended up being 4 Hispanic middle school boys, so 2 13-year-old 7th graders, Don and Jose, and then 2 12-year-old 6th graders, Evan and Ben. So the materials used mainly consisted of math worksheets, and these worksheets contained 4 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication problems, 2 of them with regrouping and 2 without regrouping, which is just a fancy word for carrying. And at least one of the numbers was greater than 12, and both had to be greater than 10. And this was, again, to avoid math facts, and this allowed all problems to be more complex than 12, our last math fact, 12 times 12. And so these worksheets were randomly generated with an online math worksheet generator, such as interventioncentral.org, which, quick plug for them, has a lot of really great resources. So if you're ever trying to look for academic interventions or potential behavioral interventions, I'd recommend checking out that website. And so generalization probes were also used, and they followed the exact same format. So they were just like the math worksheets. However, when they were utilized after sessions, they were different problems than what students had completed in their sessions that day. So in getting back to mentioning accuracy and fluency dependent variables, and so what you will typically see used, as I mentioned, is this digits correct per minute. And so to calculate this, the numbers in the correct column and place value are counted as correct. And then the total digits correct are divided by the number of seconds worked and then multiplied by 60. And so, as I mentioned, since this includes a component of time, it really is getting at fluency, because if we only look at digits correct per minute, we don't really know how accurate they are solving these problems. We just kind of know how fast they're working. And so if we add in a digits incorrect per minute, while still fluency because it is a unit of time, we can then compare correct and incorrect to see how accurate they are. Are they having 20 digits correct per minute but 0 incorrect? So we know that they have 100% accuracy in the problems they are solving. And so digits incorrect per minute was calculated in the exact same way, but incorrect digits were calculated. And so for the procedures in the study, a multiple baseline design was employed with 2 pairs of students. And so 2 sessions were conducted each day, and sessions lasted about anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes each. And so after baseline data was collected with a student, a brief experimental analysis was conducted with the first student while the second student remained in baseline. And then the interventions in the brief experimental analysis were implemented from least to most intensive. So contingent reward, because the students are only going to solve the problems once, they're going to receive no instruction on it because it's assumed that they have the skills of accuracy and fluency and are just lacking that motivation and need to have some reward that is motivating them to demonstrate those skills. And then again, repeated practice, because there's no modeling, they just solve the problems a couple times, and then cover, copy, compare with repeated practice is going to be the most intensive. So again, for the procedures of contingent reward, and so here's an example of what the math worksheets looked like on the side. So again, 4 problems, 2 with regrouping, 2 without. And so for contingent reward, again, greater performance in digits correct and digits incorrect per minute than their previous session would have resulted in them gaining access to their reward. And then repeated practice, students would complete the same set of problems 3 different times. So they would solve this worksheet, they would solve it a second time, and then they would solve it a third time. And so the actual timing and calculation of our dependent variables would be conducted on that third attempt after they have practiced these problems 2 previous times. And then finally, as I mentioned with cover, copy, compare, and repeated practice, students first completed cover, copy, compare for each of the 4 problems, and then they completed the same set 2 more times without the model. And so this would be an example of what the model looked like. And so they had a script that they would read and would walk them through the problem. And so they would use cover, copy, compare 3 different times actually, just because the area model has several steps and would be a lot for students who are struggling to maintain in kind of their working memory and remember. And so they would look at the first part of the problem and would be required to correctly divide up, in this example, 23 and 12 into 23, 10, and 2. And so once they had done that, they would look at the model again and for correctly multiplying within the boxes. And then after they had covered the problem, solved it themselves, and then compared again, they would move on to correctly adding all of the numbers within the boxes to arrive at the answer. And so once they would go back and forth with the model, they would then repeat all 4 of the problems that they would have had modeled for them 2 more times to equal the same 3 number of times solving the problems as in the repeated practice condition. So then interventions identified as least and most effective on student performance were alternated 1 more session to verify results. So if we implement brief experimental analysis procedures, and so they've had each intervention 1 time, take the least effective, the most effective, run them 1 more time. And if there was a lack of verification, so if then those 2 flipped and the one that was identified as least effective was actually more effective when they were alternated 1 more time, then the entire brief experimental analysis procedure was restarted. And then finally, as previously mentioned, a second brief experimental analysis was conducted after the desired intervention effects were observed for students provided cover, copy, compare, and repeated practice. And the reasoning for this is because we know the direction that students are going to go with the instructional hierarchy. And so we can fairly assume when you are using interventions that target accuracy, fluency, and performance-based deficits, that for students who lack accuracy, the intervention that targets accuracy is more than likely going to be the one that is most effective for them, which would be this cover, copy, compare with repeated practice. And so with the instructional hierarchy, once they've developed accuracy, we know that the next stage is going to be them developing fluency, which they have started to develop some during the accuracy stage, but then they can really take off with once they have developed that accuracy. And so if they're accurate and we re-implement brief experimental analysis procedures, now will the fluency intervention be, or even the contingent reward intervention be identified as more effective now than the accuracy intervention of cover, copy, compare plus repeated practice. And so for interscorer agreement and treatment fidelity, both were calculated for 30% of sessions. An agreement was calculated by dividing the agreed upon digits by the total digits and multiplying by 100%. Procedural fidelity checklists were created for each condition, and then undergraduate research students listened to session recordings and completed the checklist. And so interscorer agreement was just under 100%, ranging from 97 to 100, and treatment fidelity was 100%. And so just like any single case design, studies visual analysis was utilized to evaluate the effectiveness of the interventions on students' digits correct and digits incorrect per minute from baseline levels. And so if any 2 interventions appear to be equally effective, then the least intensive would be selected. And this allows for the most efficient intervention being selected. So for example, if repeated practice and cover, copy, compare with repeated practice are performing, if students are performing equally with those interventions, then we're going to choose the repeated practice since it lacks the modeling and cover copy compare component, which is much more time intensive. And so getting into the results, here are the data for Jose and Don. And so the triangular paths represent the digits incorrect per minute, and the circular data points are their digits correct per minute. And so if we're looking at Jose, we'll see that Jose was correctly identified by his teachers as an inaccurate responder. And so after conducting a brief experimental analysis with him, we see that the contingent reward condition, that R plus, really, with no modeling, isn't going to make him any more accurate. It's just going to make him work faster if he's motivated to get his reward. So we see an increase in digits correct and an increase in digits incorrect per minute. Whereas in the repeated practice, we see similar levels to baseline. And then in the cover copy compare with repeated practice condition, for the first time we see a session where his digits correct per minute are higher than his incorrect, suggesting that he's developing some accuracy. And so in looking at these first three brief experimental analyses points, we could conclude that the cover copy compare with repeated practice was most effective and the contingent reward was the least effective. And so we alternate those points one more time, and we see really quick generalization effects from Jose learning the area model, because he still is fairly accurate in our repeat of contingent reward. However, there still are some incorrect digits there, versus cover copy compare again, which has almost 0 incorrect digits and the same level of correct. And so we select cover copy compare with repeated practice as his most effective intervention and implement that. And we get basically 0 digits incorrect per minute and an increase in the number of digits correct per minute. And that white circle there constitutes a generalization probe. And so those are new problems that are different from the problems that he had in that 14th session that day. And so now that we're seeing accurate responding, this is a perfect opportunity for us to implement that second brief experimental analysis and see if these procedures are sensitive to changes in student skill acquisition. And so again, we see maintenance of his accurate responding. However, contingent reward just produces the same levels, whereas repeated practice and cover copy compare, we see a jump this time in the brief experimental analysis. And as previously mentioned, with the most efficient intervention, since we can identify contingent reward in the second brief experimental analysis as least effective, for our most effective, repeated practice is essentially negligibly less of a performance than cover copy compare and repeated practice. And since it requires much less, it's much more bang for our buck. And so we choose that as our kind of most efficient intervention. And we briefly went to a secondary baseline with Jose during this stage while Don was going through his brief experimental analysis procedures and ultimate intervention. And so due to this kind of gap and having a second baseline, we reconducted the brief experimental analysis again, just to make sure our outcome didn't change. And we still see that replication of repeated practice being identified as kind of the most effective intervention for Jose at this point. And so then we implement repeated practice and we see an increase up to what would be considered mastery range of digits correct per minute being calculated. And so back with Don, and Don kind of represented a perfect example of teachers being able to accurately rank order the performance of their students. And so if you ask teachers to list the students in their class from the best at a skill to the worst at a skill, they can do that fairly accurately. But when it comes to identifying if skills lack accuracy, or if students lack accuracy or fluency or have performance-based deficits, it's a little bit difficult. And so even though we asked for students who were inaccurate responders, Don has from his baseline is performing at levels that Jose was performing at the very end of intervention. And so when we run his brief experimental analysis, we actually see that contingent reward is the most effective, and you'll see an additional intervention condition in there, which is repeated practice plus. And so that was repeated practice with a reward, which was just something we wanted to implement and see what effects that would have on the outcome of digits correct and digits incorrect per minute. And so then in implementing contingent reward, we see this outcome in his digits correct and digits incorrect per minute, which are fairly variable, and essentially it was getting to a point where it is impossible for Don to work any faster than what he was already working at. And so then with Evan and Ben, similarly to Don, Evan is at baseline having higher numbers of digits correct per minute than digits incorrect per minute. And so once we implement his brief experimental analysis, we see that contingent reward is more effective than repeated practice and cover, copy, compare with repeated practice. So we implement that condition and see these outcomes, which are slightly more variable. And so after there is this initial decrease in his digits correct per minute in session 16, we conducted a preference assessment and got new reinforcers for Evan. And so that's when we see this spike back up in his digits correct per minute. And so for Ben, again, correctly identified as an inaccurate responder with more digits incorrect per minute than digits correct per minute. We implement his and we see a very similar pattern to Jose. So the cover, copy, compare with repeated practice being the first session that he is actually accurate and has more digits correct than incorrect per minute. And so during the implementation of that intervention, we see him develop accuracy and become an accurate responder. So we run his brief experimental analysis again. This was a situation where we did not get the verification, and so we ran our 3 intervention conditions, alternated them with repeated practice and cover, copy, compare, which was not replicated. So then started over with brief experimental analysis procedures, had repeated practice come out as most effective, and we see his digits correct improve to even higher levels and reaching close to mastery criterion. So in getting back to the purposes of this study and the outcomes that we had, so first being to extend the brief experimental analysis mathematics literature by adapting those oral reading fluency intervention packages. Fancy way of just saying that they targeted all different skill and performance deficit areas. And so these procedures were suggested to be effective for all 4 students, as they had a clearly differentiated intervention in the brief experimental analyses and had improved performance as a result. And then when looking to utilize dependent variables for both accuracy and fluency, this was really vital in measuring digits incorrect per minute proved beneficial for assessing accuracy. And so otherwise you could make incorrect decisions on student performance because when just looking at their data, you don't necessarily know how accurate students are responding. They could have really high digits correct per minute simply because they are working quickly, and you don't have data there to actually show that they're solving those problems incorrectly. And so then when looking at the utility of brief experimental analysis with more advanced mathematics calculations, being that 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication, the results were promising. And so they were cover, copy, compare with repeated practice was the most effective intervention for students who were inaccurate responders. And as we saw with our two inaccurate responders, Jose and Ben, the cover copy compare with repeated practice session was the first time that the students had higher digits correct per minute than incorrect per minute. And so then in determining the utility of a follow-up brief experimental analysis to adjust for skill acquisition, we saw that there was evidence for the sensitivity of a brief experimental analysis to detect changes in students' instructional needs. And so our two students who were administered a second brief experimental analysis, their most effective intervention was different than their initial brief experimental analysis, suggesting that it is sensitive to the changes in their needs. And so it's important to include interventions for targeting accuracy, fluency, and or performance-based deficits. As previously mentioned, that there were two students who were accurate responders that teachers identified. And so, they are still identified by their teachers for some reason. And so if teachers are incorrectly identifying them as inaccurate responders, we want to make sure we're covering all of our bases of accuracy, fluency, and or performance-based deficits to capture exactly why students are performing at the levels that they are. And so some potential limitations for the study were the potential for problem difficulty to interfere with intervention selection. And so problems on these worksheets could range from 13 times 12 to 99 times 99. And so there's a large area for kind of randomness to affect their data. However, with kind of yoking it to having two problems with regrouping and two without regrouping, that kind of puts tighter parameters on the worksheets, and typically students would have two, what we would consider easier multiplication problems and then two more difficult ones. Also, there was the potential for students to become tired or exhibit practice effects from having 2 sessions per day, and then the potential for a lack of sensitivity to both skills required. And so that being the addition skills that are required to be able to solve 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication problems. However, none of the participants demonstrated difficulty with addition. And so future research in this area should just look at having, again, additional research in the area of brief experimental analysis with math interventions and varying skills and adding to that literature base. And then moving on to how using brief experimental analysis could potentially facilitate faster RTI and MTSS processes for students. So thank you all for listening.